Something about this story doesn't quite make sense. In the winter of 1878, a constable in County Clare, Ireland, filed a report with his district office that would receive almost no attention for well over a century. The report documented the disturbance of an ancient burial ground, not by grave robbers searching for jewelry, not by treasure hunters, but by men armed with shovels, measuring tapes, and wooden crates. The bones they removed were not random. They were selected with purpose, and the records of what they were paid, and by whom, were never made public. This was not an isolated incident. Across Ireland, Scotland, and the poorer parishes of England, similar disturbances were being recorded in local church registers, in letters from alarmed priests, and in the diaries of local magistrates who seemed uncertain whether any law had actually been broken. What was happening was part of a large, well-funded, and largely invisible trade. The commodity being bought and sold was human bone, and the buyers were not criminals operating in shadow. They were some of the most respected medical schools in the British Empire. To understand what happened, you must understand the world that made it possible. By 1820, the scientific study of human anatomy had transformed European medicine. Dissection had become the foundation of medical training. A surgeon who had not spent months studying the architecture of the human skeleton, its joints, its measurements, its anomalies, was considered dangerously underprepared. Medical schools across Britain and Ireland were expanding rapidly. Edinburgh, Dublin, London, and Glasgow all competed fiercely for the most prestigious lecturers, the finest instruments, and the most complete teaching collections. Skeletons were essential. A well-prepared, fully articulated human skeleton, cleaned, wired, and mounted, could serve as a teaching tool for decades. And by the 1830s and 1840s, demand had decisively outpaced legal supply. The Anatomy Act of 1832 had attempted to address this by allowing unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals to be directed toward medical schools. But the Act created its own grim hierarchy. Poor bodies, diseased, malnourished, often short, were plentiful. What medical collectors increasingly desired was something rarer. Large bodies, unusual bodies, bodies that deviated from what they were beginning to define as the anatomical norm. Ireland in the mid-19th century was a country under severe and systematic pressure. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 had killed more than 1 million people and displaced another million or more. The land was littered with the recently dead. Workhouse records from this period, preserved in county archive collections, document the sheer volume of unclaimed mortality, bodies buried in mass graves, in fields, in the margins of estates. For a certain kind of collector, it was a landscape of supply. The skeleton trade is not entirely absent from historical records. It has simply been treated, when mentioned at all, as a footnote, an uncomfortable side effect of scientific progress, a minor embarrassment in the otherwise heroic story of Victorian medicine. But the details, when examined closely, resist that framing. Between roughly 1820 and 1900, British medical schools received a significant and poorly documented influx of skeletal material from Ireland. Museum inventories at institutions including the Royal College of Surgeons in London and the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland contain entries for Irish specimens, many logged without dates, without names, and without clear records of acquisition. A curator's note from the 1840s, preserved in a London archive, refers simply to a consignment of Irish material unsuitable for comparative study. No further details are given. What made Irish bodies particularly sought after by certain collectors was not poverty alone, it was height. The folklore surrounding Irish physical stature had long circulated in British popular culture, but by the early 19th century, it had entered the language of natural philosophy. Collectors and anatomists began to articulate a genuine institutional interest in large Irish skeletons, particularly those attributed to individuals from the western counties, where the tradition of notable height was most often described in contemporary accounts. The phrase that appeared in several purchasing records of the period is striking in its directness: specimens of superior stature. The paper trail, though fragmented, is traceable. The Royal College of Surgeons in London holds collection records documenting the acquisition of the skeleton of Charles Byrne, an Irish giant who stood near 7.5 feet tall and died in London in 1783. Byrne, aware of what would happen to his body if it fell into the hands of the surgeons, explicitly requested burial at sea. He left money to friends to ensure his wishes were carried out. He was, by every account, terrified of dissection. John Hunter, the most celebrated anatomist of his generation, wanted Byrne's skeleton. Hunter reportedly paid a member of Byrne's funeral party to substitute stones for the body before burial. The skeleton entered Hunter's collection within weeks of Byrne's death, and it remained on public display at the Hunterian Museum in London until very recently. Byrne's case is the most documented, but researchers examining provincial Irish records have identified patterns suggesting his case was not unique, only more visible. In correspondence between Irish bone preparators and London receiving agents during the 1840s and 1850s, found in collections held at several Irish university libraries, there are references to specific commissions, requests for skeletons meeting certain height criteria, for which elevated fees were offered. One letter, dated to approximately 1849, refers to a payment of £12 for a single skeleton, at a time when an agricultural labourer in Connaught might earn £4 in an entire year. £12 for a skeleton from a famine landscape. The transaction is recorded in ink, as though it were entirely ordinary. When you begin to map these records alongside other evidence, certain patterns emerge. The collector networks were not improvised. Medical schools maintained relationships with agents, men described in letters as preparators, dealers, or simply suppliers, who operated across the Irish countryside. These agents appear to have had knowledge of local burial practices, workhouse schedules, and the locations of mass graves. Their names appear occasionally in institutional correspondence, but rarely in formal accounting records, which suggests their fees were often paid outside standard purchasing channels. Researchers studying the history of anatomy collections have noted that the period of greatest acquisitive intensity, roughly 1840 to 1880, coincides almost precisely with the period of maximum Irish mortality and displacement. This is, to some extent, an obvious correlation. But historians have also noted that certain institutions appear to have made directed collecting efforts rather than simply receiving what was available. Requests for specimens of specific dimensions, commissions sent to specific regions. These are not the records of passive recipients responding to supply. They are the records of an active market. What is also notable is how carefully these acquisition records were kept, or in some cases, were not kept. Institutions that maintained meticulous purchase logs for surgical instruments and anatomical wax models often recorded Irish skeletal acquisitions in the most cursory terms. A batch of specimens, described only by number and approximate size, would enter an inventory with no county of origin, no intermediary named, no date of death for the individual whose remains had been purchased. The most striking fragments of this story do not come from institutional records. They come from the margins. A Catholic priest in County Galway, writing to his bishop in 1852, described the distress of his parishioners after discovering that a burial site used during the famine had been disturbed. He wrote that he could not identify who was responsible, but that the pattern of disturbance suggested someone with knowledge of which graves were recent and which contained individuals of notable size. His letter requested guidance on whether the church could take legal action. The bishop's reply, if there was one, has not been located. In a small collection of personal papers donated to a Cork library in the 1970s, there are diary entries from a young man who worked briefly as an assistant to a bone preparator in the 1860s. He describes the work in almost clinical terms for several months. Then, in a single entry, his tone shifts. He notes that a delivery arrived containing the remains of a very tall man. He describes the femur as the longest he had ever seen, and that his employer was unusually animated. The entry ends abruptly. Several pages appear to have been removed from the diary at a later date. It is not possible to say when or by whom. These are fragments. They do not constitute proof of a coordinated program, but they resist the interpretation of coincidence. The questions that remain are not small ones. How many skeletons entered British and Irish medical collections through channels that bypass the legal protections, such as they were, that existed at the time? Historians who have attempted to audit collection records have consistently noted that the acquisition documentation for specimens from this period is unusually thin. This could reflect administrative casualness. It could reflect something else. Why were the Irish specifically sought? The preference for large specimens is documented, but large individuals existed in England, in Scotland, in every country from which medical schools were drawing material. The correspondence that survives suggests something beyond mere size. There was a taxonomic interest at work, a desire to place Irish physical characteristics within the emerging frameworks of racial and national typology that were becoming fashionable in certain scientific circles by the 1840s. The skeletons were not only teaching tools. Some of them were specimens in a different and more troubling sense. And what happened to Charles Byrne? His skeleton was displayed. His wishes were disregarded. He knew what the collectors wanted, and he took what precautions he could, and they were not sufficient. A man who feared becoming a specimen became one. His case was argued over in medical ethics journals as recently as the 2000s, with many voices calling for his burial at sea, as he had requested. As of the early 2000s, that had not yet happened. There is something in that continuity that deserves attention. The debate has not resolved. The skeleton remains. Perhaps all of this can be explained. Perhaps the missing records are simply missing. The ordinary losses of time, of fire, of administrative neglect. Perhaps the preference for Irish specimens was purely mechanical, driven by nothing more sinister than availability during a period of catastrophic mortality. Perhaps the agents and preparators who operated in the Irish countryside were simply men performing a legal, if distasteful, function in a society that had decided that medical progress required certain difficult compromises. Perhaps there is no hidden story here. Perhaps there is only the story that has always been visible, if anyone wished to see it clearly. A story about whose bodies were considered available and whose wishes were considered negotiable, and which kinds of grief were recorded and which were left to fade without a name. But some of the records are gone. Some of the graves are disturbed. Some of the skeletons are still in glass cases in buildings with great stone facades, their origins listed only as unknown, their measurements noted carefully, and their identities lost entirely. What would it mean to know their names? What would it mean to return them? These are not questions that the archives can answer. They may be questions the archives were arranged to prevent.